Hello, and welcome to the Anxiety RX podcast. I am your host, Dr. Russell Kennedy. Recently, I did a Q&A session for my MBRX people, the people that are in my MBRX program. And the session went about 2.5 hours long. So it's a very long session. So I've chopped it up into 4 segments for the podcast. And I hope you enjoy the segments. I hope you get something out of it. It gave me a chance to really explain my theory of anxiety based on what people ask me. Often I will say, this is what I believe anxiety is. But when you get the questions from other people, it really helps me elaborate on exactly what I mean and made it personal for a lot of people. So I really hope you enjoy each segment. Hello. In this session, I am going to answer your questions sent to me to give you a better perspective as to what my perspective is on healing anxiety. And my book and my program, MBRX, people have sent me questions through Instagram, through MBRX, and I'm going to try and answer them here. I'll probably put this out on my podcast, but I will put it directly into MBRX to answer some of the questions that people are having. So I will read the question. I will try and answer it as best I can. I'm going to do this off the cuff as best I can. So let's get into it. So the first question, what is the difference between alarm and symptoms? Well, alarm is symptoms. Alarm is your symptoms. Sometimes people will feel it in their chest or their throat or their back or their gut, but usually it's somewhere in the midline. And alarm is this intense sensation in the body. That's what the alarm is. So the difference between alarm and symptoms is that the alarm is the symptoms. Now, I understand that people will think the worry is a symptom of anxiety, of which it is. But the alarm is the fundamental cause. The alarm is what drives the worry. The alarm is this old, unresolved energy or pain or trauma that's still held in your body. Now, it can be held in the brain's representation of the body. There's a part of our brain called the insula, which I'll talk about later on. I know there's a couple of questions about the brain later on. I'll bring that back in. But the insula may be this part of our brain. It's deep, deep in our brain that has this sensation attached to it. And that sensation may be this remnant of unresolved trauma that's held in our body. So to speak that in English, when we get traumatized as children, the insula, along with the amygdala, along with the ego, and all these other things that hopefully I'll be able to answer in this Q&A session, kind of meld together to form this emotional signature of pain that's in your body. And that pain is what I call alarm. And the alarm in your body, in me, it's in my solar plexus, that alarm in your body is what drives the thoughts of your mind. There is this process called interoception where your brain is always reading your body. And if it detects the sense of alarm, this energy that's disconnected and painful, it's got to do something with that. So the brain will typically make up worries at that particular point. And then you associate the worry with the pain. The pain actually comes first. The alarm is what comes first. And the anxiety, the worries are what your mind, what your brain is doing to make sense of this alarm that it senses in your body. So the difference between alarm and symptoms, there isn't really any difference. The alarm is the symptoms, but most people attribute anxiety to the worries of the mind, and it's not. It's actually this state of alarm that's held in your body, typically from old, unresolved pain, typically from childhood. Next question. When I do find the alarm, I think I'm identifying it in my throat, but my throat feels like it's closing. Is that a symptom of alarm? Yeah. There's many symptoms of alarm. The thing about alarm and through the insula is that we have this sensation in our body that's a representation of this old pain that was never processed or metabolized when we were younger. So I believe the insula makes us feel now in our body exactly the same way when we were 5 and being abused or 8 or being hit or whatever. It's the same feeling. So when we feel that same feeling, we age regress. We go back to the time, say 5 or 8 or 10 years old, with all the wherewithal that a 5, 8 or 10-year-old would have. So of course we don't feel like we have a lot of agency in the world. And when we feel that pain, takes us back to a time where we felt very powerless, and didn't have anything that we could particularly do to overcome that dysphoria, that pain. So what we did was we went up into our heads and we started to worry, because the worry gave us some illusion that we had some control over the issue itself. So what I notice with people with alarm is it can feel hot and cold at the same time. It can feel sharp and dull at the same time. We're dealing with these subconscious processes, these processes below the level of the rational brain. So it's like dreaming in a way. You can dream that you can fly. You can dream that you can do all these weird things that you could never do in reality, in real life. But that's what we're dealing with these old programs that cause our anxiety, that cause our pain. They don't make a lot of sense either. So that's why people can say it feels superficial and deep at the same time. It feels hot and cold at the same time. So these symptoms of alarm that we have in our body, the more we can drill down into them, the better we can start sensing them, the better we can start feeling the sensations, the images, the memories, the behaviors that it elicits. The more we can start seeing that it's the alarm that's causing these things, the more we can have some control over it and see it coming. If we can see the alarm coming, we can do something about it. But if we're already overwhelmed and we're taken back to being a 5-year-old, we don't really have a lot of agency at that particular point. So there's a lot of symptoms of alarm that are nonsensical. Like I said, being burning hot and freezing cold at the same time. There's people that say, I feel it in my throat. A lot of women with demanding mothers feel their alarm in their throat because they could never express, they could never say out loud, this is hurting me, stop doing this. So that energy gets trapped in their throat. And that's where they feel their alarm. Now, that's just a pattern I see. It doesn't mean that if you have alarm in your throat that you couldn't say something, but a lot of times it does. But finding where that alarm is really important, because then we can zero in on it. We can say, is it hot? Is it cold? Is it superficial? Is it deep? Does it radiate anywhere? Does it feel like it's hollow? Or the language is really important when you isolate your alarm. Exactly how does it feel? Because a lot of times we're dealing, like I said, with these subconscious, these below the rational mind interpretations that your mind is making, and they don't make a lot of sense a lot of times. So the more sense we can make out of them, and this is where I get sensation without explanation, is I want you to sense this alarm. I want you to go into it and feel as many characteristics of this alarm as you can. Is it cold? Is it sharp? Is it spiky? Is it dull? Is it hollow? Like, how does it feel? Because the more we dive into it, the more we can get in and start moving it around, and the more we can start feeling it. And you got to feel it to heal it. So when we feel it, we can start changing it. But if we just go into our mind every time we feel this alarm, this anxiety, we never process the alarm. We're always stuck in our heads. So is that a symptom of alarm, the throat closing? Absolutely. Absolutely, it's a symptom of alarm. Anything in the area where you feel the alarm, for me, like I said, it's in my solar plexus. Really tune into that feeling and see if you can really get into it. Really see how it feels. Be curious about, I wonder why that feels so sharp, or I wonder why that feels so hollow. The more curiosity you can lend to this alarm, the more the emotion doesn't take you over, because curiosity is a rational part of your brain. So when you get curious about this subcortical, these subconscious programs that create this alarm in your body, you can start opening them up and seeing them a lot better, rather than just being a victim to them, where you just immediately go upstairs into your head and just start to worry like crazy. How does that work with other symptoms like diarrhea or migraines or foot pain? Is that alarm, or are those symptoms in this model? How do you differentiate? It's tough. Physical symptoms can be associated with the alarm. So what I ask people to do is, when you have, say, the foot pain or you have the back pain, is the alarm in your system also lit up? So if you're feeling a deep sense of alarm in your chest, and it's always associated with right knee pain or stomach cramps or diarrhea or whatever it is, that symptom is probably related to this old unresolved energy that you can't process or you haven't been able to process so far. Whereas if you're getting, chronic knee pain and yet the alarm from your emotional sense isn't there, that's probably not associated with it. So I would check for the coactivity of this physical symptom with the alarm. So if the alarm is active and you have this symptom, they're probably linked, they're probably coupled. But if you have this symptom and you're not feeling alarmed, they're probably not. Now, that's a general rule, not always the case, but I find that's one way of differentiating the pure alarm state from other symptoms that you might be having. I bought this, I guess this is MBRX for my 10-year-old. How do I explain childhood self when she is in the midst of childhood? At what age do you feel it switches? This is a tough one because childhood anxiety and adult anxiety, I believe, are very different things. I think the child picks up the energy of the world, and the energy of the world right now is quite stressful. And I think if you were born sensitive as a child, you will pick up the energy of the world. And on top of that, if your parents are alarmed, if you have a parent with anxiety or depression or OCD or an eating disorder, I think the kids pick that up. I really do. I think that they feel it. So childhood anxiety is not the same as this kind of sense of alarm. It can be, but it's not the same as the adults that I see. The adults that have, yes, I have this alarm, it's in my upper chest, it's squeezing, it makes me feel like I want to vomit, it's deep in my chest, and I start getting these horrible, horrible thoughts about cancer or dying or whatever when I have this sensation of alarm. Children don't associate so much with the cognitive aspects of anxiety and alarm, but they do feel it. So I think MBRX can help children by getting them in touch with their bodies, getting them in touch with the feeling that they have in their bodies, and being able to isolate where that alarm is in their system. Because children really respond well to touch, so do adults, but children really respond well to touch. So it is one of those things that I think MBRX isn't classically designed for children, but there are concepts in MBRX that will help the child understand. When you're worried, look for a place in your body that's lit up, as opposed to, or instead of saying lit up, that's more active, that's more painful. Look for a place that hurts and see if you can help the child find that place that hurts. So again, MBRX isn't really designed specifically for children. It's designed for adults, but the concepts in it are very applicable to children. Is finding the alarm in your system, dealing with the alarm, dealing with it through your body first, and then using more cognitive strategies, because children aren't as cognitive as adults, but children are the ones that learn how to worry too. So it's, can you redirect a child into their body as opposed to their automatic default setting, which is going to be to go into their head and worry and worry. And worry does make the uncertain seem a little more certain. So worry does provide us with an instantaneous sense of relief. That's why we do it. Worry gives us this tiny sense of relief, but then we believe our worries, and then we need to go back to worry again to try and reestablish that little sense of relief that we have, and we get caught in that addictive loop of worry, which of course aggravates the alarm, which of course aggravates the worry, which aggravates the alarm and the alarm anxiety cycle, and we just keep going. And we're just caught in that loop where we never actually deal with the underlying problem, which is the sense of alarm. Next question. What part of the brain, for example, the frontal lobe, does this come from? This is really popular in neuroscience now, is to try and isolate parts of the brain that are responsible for certain things. There's a problem, a diagnosis called prosopagnosia, which is the inability to recognize faces, which seems to come from the fusiform gyrus in the brain. Now, you don't have to understand any of that, but what I'm saying is that emotions are very distributed through the brain. The brain's an associational organ. There's so many different places that the brain has connections to make an emotion. that we can't isolate. Anger comes from this part. Fear comes from this part. Now, we all know about the amygdala. We all know that the amygdala is involved in just about every fear reaction in the brain. But does that mean the amygdala starts it? Not necessarily. No. So this idea that we can find this part of a brain that has anxiety and somehow disturb that or somehow impair that so we don't get the brain is such a highly connected associational organ that there's no one place where this occurs. Now, the rational part of our brain, prefrontal cortex, the cortex, that's where we start creating our worries. That's why worries are specific. If you had a father or a mother who died from cancer, sometimes you will get a phobia of having cancer. Whereas someone who didn't have a parent who died from cancer, cancer isn't one of their big worries. So this is the cortex. This is the thinking part of our brain that kind of modulates and modifies our worries. But there's no part of the brain specifically that creates anxiety. Again, it's a combination of a bunch of different things. It's also something we learn as children to start associating worry with this sense of alarm, even though we're not aware of the alarm in our body a lot of the time. So there's no one part of the brain that's involved in anxiety. And again, a lot of people will talk about the amygdala, and the amygdala certainly plays a huge role in fear of any kind, but it's an associational role. Like the amygdala doesn't modulate anxiety specifically. It's one of the factors that's in there, but there's a syndrome called Orbach-Vita syndrome where the amygdala deteriorates, and part of the anxiety decreases in people, but some of it stays. So the amygdala isn't the sole arbiter or the sole place where anxiety comes from. So there isn't a sole place, a single place where anxiety comes from in the brain. And I hope that answers the question. It's just understanding that your brain is very associational. It has many different connections to many different parts. And it's the sum total of that that comes up with our rational explanation of anxiety, of worry, and how worry becomes the go-to because in a way, like I said, worrying makes the uncertain appear more certain, which gives us a little dopamine hit, which kind of tells us we're on the right track, but we're not. We're not on the right track at all. We're actually making it worse by adding more worry into the mix. So again, there's no single part of the brain that's involved in anxiety. Next question. And how is this different from the id, the ego, superego, or lizard brain, or the names for the parts of the brain that control the nervous system? Well, id, ego, and superego are Freudian terms. The id is the fundamental tendency of you as a person, the drive for sex, the drive for food, the drive for recognition on some level. Whereas the ego kind of modulates that. It sort of drives us. If you have a strong desire for external validation, it will drive you to, say, become a public speaker or that kind of thing. And the superego is kind of like a Freudian term for your conscience. So if you find a wallet on the street that's got a bunch of money in it and you turn it in, that's kind of your conscience. That's your superego. So none of these things, again, have specific locales in the brain. Like this is a global way that you process information. The lizard brain is the reptilian brain, is the brain stem, and it controls the bodily functions. So yes, it's involved, but again, if we look at the insular cortex, we look at the amygdala, we look at the combination of the two, yes, they influence the lizard brain. They influence the brain stem, the part of the brain just before you go into the spinal cord that creates rapid heartbeat, that creates this sense of sweating, that creates this tightness in your gut. So the reptilian brain, the brain stem, controls your body, but there's a lot of structures that are higher up into the brain that really feed into the brain stem. And the brain stem is also involved in the fight or flight response. So the amygdala is very key in kicking off that fight or flight response. I also believe that the insula and the amygdala, and to some extent the ego, the overprotective ego, act together to send a signal to the brainstem that's familiar. This is my old familiar. That's why anxiety feels the same in people. Alarm feels the same across. Like, it may feel different in different people, but to a single person, anxiety usually feels the same way. It's just a variation of intensity. Sometimes you feel very anxious or very alarmed. Sometimes you're like, oh, I'm a little apprehensive about going to this party, but I'm still going to do it. So there's a gradation there. And I think the triggering effect of your brain, if you go through a situation as a child and then you re-experience that situation as an adult, that's highly triggering. That fires into the brainstem, that fires into your body, and that's stuff that's really hard to ignore. So say you were 13 years old and giving a presentation to your class, and you did something dumb and they laughed at you and you felt completely embarrassed. Now, when you're faced with talking in front of an audience, you may get that very same feeling in your body, modulated by the insulin and the amygdala, that creates this sense that you are back in that same place again, which is what I'm saying earlier in the Q&A, is that we create this sense in our body that feels exactly the same way each time. And then our mind tries to make up worries or tries to talk ourselves out of what is ultimately a feeling problem, which works in the short term, but not in the long term. So we wind up worrying and worrying and worrying and worrying to try and keep ourselves ahead of this alarm. And rather than deal with the alarm directly, rather than going right at the alarm, because that's the underlying problem in the first place. Okay, that was apparently all one question. That was from one person. So I hope that answered all your questions. This is question 2. Do you have an opinion on ketamine treatments? I asked on your Instagram page and someone wrote back to me saying you won't weigh in on other treatments, but I would really love your opinion because you're an MD. I've been using your book and lessons and they've helped me greatly, but I've also used ketamine along with it and it's been really great for me. But I would really love to hear your opinion. So ketamine, people think is a psychedelic. It's not. It's actually a dissociative. It's used as an anesthetic. And what ketamine does is it blocks NMDA receptors. And when it blocks NMDA receptors in the brain, it releases a tremendous amount of what's called glutamate. Now, glutamate is an excitatory neurotransmitter, which typically you would think would accelerate anxiety in the brain. That's what I would think. Whenever I see something that's glutaminergic or increases glutamate in the brain, I always think that it creates more anxiety. But apparently ketamine does this increase in glutamate, but doesn't increase anxiety. In fact, it decreases anxiety in a lot of people. Not everybody. We'll talk about that in a minute. So what happens when you increase the glutamate in the brain is that you create this dissociative state where people think it's the same thing as like when people say, I came out of my body. I was in a car accident. I came out of my body. It creates this dissociative state. You're not the same person that you were before, which is great because if you're a worry ward, if you're someone who chronically worries, yeah, you don't want to be that person. So you can actually look back and see, oh, that's a different person than me. That's something different from me, that person that chronically worries. So you dissociate from this well-known personality of yours of being a worrier. And you can see it with more curiosity. And it also ketamine may also act in the same way as the psychedelics in a way, is it paralyzes that ego. It paralyzes that inner critic. So you can kind of feel yourself as you are in this sort of pure state. And when you can see yourself in a pure state without all this worry, without all this sort of compulsive need to keep yourself safe by worrying all the time, it changes you. It's almost like when you've seen over the hill, you can never go back. Once you've seen the answer, you know it's there, you know it's present. Whereas before that, if all you did was worry and nothing ever got solved, you would just be in this horrible limbo state where you never felt safe. So ketamine, for some people, gives them this feeling that they feel safe. And then you can anchor to that feeling that you feel safe and create this sort of sense of safety within you, which is essentially what healing from anxiety really is creating this sense of safety rather than having to rely on this sense of protection all the time. So when you create a sense of safety within yourself, when you know it's in there, And this is where people have religious experiences, psychedelic experiences, and they see this place of safety and they know it's in them. There's a security in that. And you can't heal from anxiety or any nervous disorder, I think, without a sense of safety. That is the foundation of being able to reach out and try other things from this place of safety. And then you realize, you know what? That didn't go as well as I thought, but I'm still safe. I'm still okay, which is something you didn't have as a child. Typically, when your dad is screaming at you or your mom's drunk or whatever it is, there's no escape from that as a child. You can't get away from that. But as an adult, we now see that we have the choice to not worry, to go into our body, to create a sense of safety, even if it's, taking ketamine. We have some control over that situation. Whereas as a child, we never did. We didn't have that control. So a lot of recovering from anxiety or healing anxiety is realizing there is this safe place inside of you. There is this, you're not responsible for fixing everything. There is a higher order. There is a consciousness that's greater than you are, that is supporting you, that you just don't allow yourself to see. So what ketamine, I think, does, and the psychedelics do this too, is they show you that it's not all up to you. There are external forces that help you, that you just won't allow yourself to see. And once you start seeing those things, I think that you start creating this sense of safety. Faith is like this. Create not necessarily religious faith, but just faith in general. A lot of times when people get caught into worry, I say, can you just suspend this worry? Can you just leave this worry for a moment? Feel this sense of alarm in your body and just go into this sense of faith that things will be okay and hand it over to something else. People say, hand it over to God. If you're not religious, just hand it over to consciousness. That's what I do. I believe there is an order in the universe and consciousness is what it is. So you can hand things over to consciousness. And you're not totally responsible at that point, because when you're a traumatized child, you feel you're totally responsible. In a way, when you're a traumatized child, you lose faith in the world, because as a child, you're supposed to be protected. You're supposed to be seen, heard, protected, and loved. And a lot of us didn't get that. Or we were so sensitive that it didn't matter how loving and caring our parents were, we were still going to feel unsafe. And I think there are a lot of people like that their parents were okay. They weren't abusive. They weren't terribly narcissistic, but the child was just so sensitive, they didn't get what they needed. And I think it's really important to understand that we are not children anymore. We do have agency in our lives. And if we do decide to go to the psychedelic route or the ketamine route or the MDMA route, that's our decision. And we can learn from that. We can also understand that there is faith in the world. We can have faith because, like I said, when you get traumatized as a child, you lose your sense of faith. And life starts to become about protection instead of growth. If you grow up in a loving, caring, connected family, you learn that life is about growth, about exploration, about individuation, about finding yourself. If you grow up in a family where there's trauma, you learn that life is about protection, and you spend your life trying to remain protected. And the more you focus on something, the more of that you get. So if you focus on growth, you will get more growth. If you focus on protection, that's the lens that you will see the world through. You will see the world through the eyes of protection. And by definition, you'll never feel safe. And if you'd have asked me 10 years ago, have you ever felt safe? I would say no. I'd say no, I've never felt safe. So there's no question as to why I would feel anxiety. But if you ask me now, there's plenty of times that I feel safe, even if it's just for a few seconds. And I'll talk about that in the Q&A a little farther along. But that's my opinion on psychedelics. Psychedelics, to me, are kind of a last resort. They're not something that I recommend freely. But if you do have anxiety, you have tried so many different things, nothing seems to work. As long as the people that are doing the psychedelic experience or doing the ketamine experience are experienced, they know the safety risks, then I think it's fine. Then go ahead and be an adult and find your own way. but it's not a panacea. There are things about the psychedelics and about any of these drug treatments that can make you worse. Now, I don't want to scare you, but it's one of those things that you have to be really wise about your decision to do this. I would go with somatic therapy for a while, internal family systems therapy for a while, go with MBRX, learn the procedures in MBRX, and learn to have some agency yourself, where you can show yourself that you're safe. You can show yourself that you are indeed safe. And you're not relying on some doctor or pseudo parent or friend or whatever to heal you, to help you. It's up to you. You can do this yourself. And I think that's what psychedelics do. I think they show you that you have this tremendous power inside of yourself. And one of the things that I think that it does help with is this victim mentality that everybody with anxiety has. I think as a victim, you start thinking that everything's up to me, everything's up to inside of you. And if you don't feel like you're getting better and everything is up to you, of course, you're going to look at yourself negatively. Of course, you're going to look at yourself like a failure. And I think it's really important to sense that you can create safety inside of yourself. Kind of a long answer, but that's my answer on ketamine. Question 3. I've had agoraphobia on and off for 25 years. A psychiatrist told me it's a cyclical disorder and never really completely goes away. Do you agree that it is only something that can be managed, or think it's curable? Cure is a funny word in medicine. We don't use it too much. Like, I would say that my anxiety is cured for the most part. Do I still get anxious? Do I still get alarmed? Absolutely. Is it still uncomfortable? Absolutely. But I feel like I have agency now. I feel like I know what to do. I feel like I can ground myself and center myself and create this place for myself where I do feel like I'm cured. I don't go down the rabbit hole. I don't go into that spiral where I can't get out of alarm and anxiety anymore. So agoraphobia is basically your brain's response to other people, to connection. So when you're afraid to be around a bunch of other people, I would wonder, did you have an experience when you were a child where you were in a crowd and you experienced trauma? That's the first place I would go. The other place is that when we are alarmed, when our system is in deep protection, we default back into this place where we lose our social engagement system. If you've read the book, you know about the social engagement system. It uses eye contact, tone of voice, prosody of voice, body language, and facial expressions as a way to human beings connect with each other and make each other feel safe. Now, if you are alarmed, if you're in survival physiology, you shut off your social engagement system. So it's hard to make eye contact. It's hard to read other people's faces. There's studies that show that when you are in alarm state, you will see neutral faces as threatening. It's just your brain is in this protection mode. You're seeing through the lens of protection. So it's really, can you ground yourself inside of yourself first? So before you're going into that situation where there's other people, can you create this place in you that is safe, that you can go into, that you can use some physiological sighs, 2 quick sniffs in and a long exhale out? Can you do a number of those? Can you put your hand over your alarm? Can you ground yourself? Can you feel your feet? Can you teach yourself that you can create these little islands of safety for yourself? And when you create these little islands of safety, and this is what MBRX helps you do, is it creates these little islands of safety. And after a while, when you create more and more islands, they congeal into kind of a landmass where you can go back to and you can feel safe. So if you are going into a situation where there are people, there are crowds, you do have this thing you can do before you go into it in grounding yourself and connecting with yourself and connecting with the child in you that maybe had that horrible experience in a crowd when they were younger. Connecting with that younger version of yourself, getting into the sort of lizard brain, the reptilian brain that controls your body, using these techniques to show yourself that you're safe and that you are doing it for yourself. Again, you're not relying on some doctor or medication or whatever. I have nothing against medications, by the way. You're not relying on something else. You're relying on yourself to help yourself, which in and of itself becomes this virtuous cycle that helps you because you realize I can do this myself. This is one of the things with me that really helped my anxiety kind of or alarm fade considerably. It's like, I'm doing this. I'm in charge of this. It's kind of like when I used to see people with panic attacks in my office as a doctor, and I would give them benzodiazepine, like Ativan, Xanax, something like that. And I would only give them a couple of tablets. And I'd say, the next time you get a panic attack, put one of these under your tongue or swallow it. And they would do that, and it would take the panic attack away. And after that, all they had to do was know that they had this tablet on them somewhere, or in their car or whatever, or somewhere close. And when they started to feel the panic attack, they could kind of say to themselves, you know what? I'm okay. I'm going to go through this. I'm going to be okay. I have something if I absolutely need it. So when you develop this agency that you can do it for yourself, it creates this sense inside of you that you're not that lonely, abandoned child anymore, and you can actually look after yourself. And I think it really deeply goes into our psyche at that point. The more we start healing from anxiety, the better we feel, but not right away. And I'm going to talk about that later on, because initially, when you start healing from your anxiety, the anxiety often gets worse because the anxiety perceives it's protecting you. Your ego is perceiving that it is protecting you by keeping you warned. There's all these warnings, what ifs, worst case scenarios, and your ego thinks that it's protecting you by warning you about all this stuff. And all it's doing is just making you more worried. All it's doing is making you feel unsafe. So as far as agoraphobia goes, it's really learning these techniques to ground yourself, to start developing confidence in yourself. And MBRX is designed to do this so that you know that you can handle it yourself. You may feel uncomfortable in crowds. Yeah. And that's the time to do some physiological size. Put your hand over your alarm. Even like tapping, EFT, this kind of stuff helps you in the short term. But really what we're trying to do is get you to connect with that younger version of yourself where this started in the first place and heal it at its source. Get into it at its source and show that child in you that the adult in you is going to see them, hear them, understand them, be open to them, love them, and defend them and protect them. And that's when we get back into our social engagement system again. That's when we're able to connect. That's when we're able to feel safe in the presence of others. And especially if you have someone, if you're going into a crowd, that you can feel safe with. But again, it's not relying on something external to you. It's creating this sense of safety within yourself, which takes time and practice. That's what eventually heals you. That's what eventually gives you the confidence. And it's the confidence that pulls you out of victim mentality. It's the confidence that says, you know what? I've been in this crowd before. I don't like it, but I'm going to do it. I'm just going to lean into it. Because here's one thing about the brain is that when you get on your heels, when you start leaning back away from what scares you, your brain starts secreting norepinephrine through the locus coeruleus in your brain, which lights up your brain and it makes you very acutely aware of what could be dangerous. Also, your HPA axis starts creating chemicals that create cortisol from the adrenals on your kidneys. So not only is your brain lit up, but your body gets lit up with cortisol when you withdraw, when you start leaning into victim mode. I can't do this. This is too much for me. When you lean into victim mode, your brain starts creating norepinephrine, your body starts secreting cortisol, and then your brain decides, hey, we're in danger. What are we afraid of? We're afraid of crowds. We can't go into crowds. I'm afraid of buses. I can't go on buses. I'm afraid of grocery stores, so I can't go into grocery stores. And your life gets narrower and narrower and narrower. But when you actually lean into your fear, after you've grounded yourself, after you've found this place of safety in yourself, then you start creating a place where you move into your fear. And when you move towards your fear, you start secreting dopamine because your brain says, hey, you're on the right track. And there's a place in the brainstem called the periaqueductal gray, which starts creating endogenous opioids, which is kind of like the brain's natural morphine. So the way I often describe it to people is you're at a party, you're attracted to someone across the way. There's two things you can do. One is you can lean on your balls of your feet and go over and you can talk to that person and your brain will secrete morphine and it will secrete dopamine to support you in this threat. And often I will have people come back to me and say, I did get rejected by that person, but I still felt so good about myself because I went over and did it. Now, the other option is now, they're just going to reject me. They might yell at me. They might do all sorts of things to me. And I'm just going to stay here because it's the safer option. And your brain says, okay, you choose that. I'll give you cortisol and I'll give you norepinephrine in your brain. But if you choose to actually go at your fear, if you choose to walk in there, now you have to be grounded first. It's not just, automatically just, I'm going to go into what scares me automatically. Although there is some evidence to suggest that helps too, but it's a much better way to just ground yourself first and then decide, I'm going to challenge this. I'm just going to go and do this. But you have to develop this sense of safety in your system first if you're going to be successful in the long term. So is agoraphobia a life sentence? No, I don't think so. I think there are lots of people that I've helped with specifically social anxiety and to some extent agoraphobia that ground themselves in their body and actually enjoy going into events now because they know they have the confidence to do it. And I think it's just a lot of anxiety is just, it tricks you. It tricks you all the time. And if you're in this sort of survival reflex state, you're going to fall for your brain's tricks. But if you're in a sense of safety, in a sense of grounding, you can see your brain's tricks and you go, oh, brain, I know you're trying to trick me into this. And I appreciate you trying to help me stay safe, but I'm going to do this anyway. And this is part of feel the fear and do it anyway. So it's something to be managed, or do you think it's curable? I think agoraphobia is absolutely curable. That word, I don't like using that word so much. I think you'll probably still have a problem with crowds, but you'll feel in control. You'll feel like I can do this, and you will do it. And the more you do it, the more you'll feel like you can. So I do think it's curable. And that will conclude this segment of the Anxiety RX podcast and this segment of the Q&A. And I hope you join me next time for the Anxiety RX podcast. And thanks.